This is St Mary's Church in Northchurch, Hertfordshire, a church full of history and stories. The story I am going to tell you is one of intrigue and curiosity. The story is of a young boy called Peter the Wild Boy, who became a sensation in Georgian London in the 18th century. How did he end up buried here? Where did he come from? A long way away in Germany in 1725. There are two accounts of how Peter the Wild Boy was found in Germany in a forest called Hartwald Forest. The first one is George I was out hunting with his party when he came across this boy, a feral boy, naked, with no speech. How did he get there? Why was he there? Was he abandoned by his parents? Story got out about this boy, and rumours had it he was with wolves and they were looking after him, or the bears even. There were so many stories. And the other version is that George I found out about him after he was captured. They went out to find him in the woods and he was captured and imprisoned, and George I found out and had him brought back to England. The story of him being hunted down is more likely, but whichever it is, he did indeed go to London in 1726 and join Princess Caroline and George I in Kensington Palace. Soon after his arrival, he was taken to Kensington Palace to sit for William Kent, the painter who was decorating the King's grand staircase with portraits of the King's favourite servants. Here we see Peter with his tutor John Arbuthnot. He is wearing a green suit and is holding acorns and acorn leaves, one of his favourite things. On the 7th of April 1726, there was big excitement in London. George I and his courtiers were gathering in the drawing room at St James's Palace. It was crammed with people, sitting in anticipation for the big event. The doors opened and in came the Wild Boy. Everyone gasped and looked at this boy who was all bent and couldn't speak. They looked at this child and thought, this is great amusement, and the boy, Peter, became like a human pet. The gossip of this event spread all over London, and people were rushing to the Strand and queuing to see the wax statue of Peter in a famous gallery on the Strand. Peter was very naughty and used to put his hands in people's pockets to look for acorns, and he also used to steal things, and if he did, he was corrected by being whipped with a leather belt. Daniel Defoe thought the most wonderful wonder, the most interesting thing in the world, and Jonathan Swift agreed with him. This picture is from one of the pamphlets. Peter was fodder for all the satirical pamphlets that were about at the time. People like Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, all were writing about him and saying things and exaggerating the things that he did, his antics that he got up to, with much exaggeration. And word was saying, could this boy, does he have a soul? Has he really got a soul? Well, they must have thought he did have a soul because he was baptised. Prince of the Enchanted Forest, adopted son of the fairy folk, Wild Boy, your reputation precedes you, child. All of Germany has been talking about you lately, and yet no one knows your name. The boy looked up at the king and smiled. The king smiled back and took a deep breath. Henceforth you shall be known as Peter. Dr. John Arbuthnot tried his hardest to teach Peter to speak and to have good manners, but he failed, so he tired of him, and soon after Princess Caroline and George I also tired of him, his wild ways and his behaviour. George I died. Peter was sent to retirement to a farm in Berkhamsted. Peter came here, Broadway Farm in Berkhamsted, under the care of Thomas Fenn, who was given £35 a year to look after him. Peter had lots of funny ways. He used to like eating whole raw onions. The other thing that really amused him was filling the dung cart up and then empty it again, at the farmer's dismay. Peter wandered all the way to Norwich. How did he get there? How did he survive and look after himself? We'll never know. But he got caught. They thought he was a vagrant and he couldn't speak. So they picked him up and he ended up in a prison, in Bridewell Prison. This prison set on fire one night and all the prisoners were taken out, but one remained. Peter remained in, looking at the frames. They had to drag him out and they took him to the workhouse. Fortunately, Mr. Thomas Fenn had put an advert out in the paper for his return, and he was returned back to the farm. This is the actual advert from the London Post, Evening Post. Lost or strayed away from Broadway in the parish of Northchurch about 3 months ago. The wild youth, a black hairy man about 5'8" high. He cannot speak to be understood, but makes a kind of humming noise and answers to the manner of the name Peter. Whoever will bring him to Mr. Thomas Fenn's should receive a reasonable charge and handsome gratuity. This is Bridewell Prison, the actual prison he was kept in. This is the original door they came out of when it was set on fire. The plaque and the little statue can still be seen in Norwich today. Berkhamsted School, a well-known school in this area. Graham Greene attended here, but they have the most interesting curiosity item that once was worn by Peter. This is the item they have in their archives at Berkhamsted School. It looks like a slave collar, but it's not. It's Peter's actual collar and was used for a much different reason. It reads, "Peter the Wild Man from Hanover, whoever will bring him to Mr. Fenn at Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire, shall be paid for their trouble." Mr. Fenn did not want Peter wandering off miles again. It was okay for him to stay local, but he didn't want him to ever have that kind of journey again. So that's why the collar was made, not for cruelty, but for his safety, to keep him safe, so that if he wandered off, he could be brought back again. Peter lived out the rest of his life at Broadway Farm, Berkhamsted. Several farmers took care of him over the years. He loved to dance and he loved music, and he would work amongst the workers on the farm. New evidence suggests that in 1724, Jürgen Mayer found Peter in Germany in one of his fields, and he then took him along to the poorhouse. Peter lived out the rest of his life in Berkhamsted, and when he was old, the last farmer died, and within days Peter also died. He was so sad and grief-stricken, and he was buried here in Northchurch, in St Mary's Church. The parishioners and all the locals paid to have his tombstone put on the grave. As you come into the nave of the church, there is a lovely small exhibit all about Peter's life. Even today, people come and put flowers on Peter's grave. Peter's grave has been granted with a Grade 2 listing, marking it as a monument of special historic interest. But it's the man who is buried under it who makes it historically significant.